All right, lesson 3 deals with the formal powers of the executive in the Texas government, which is obviously the governor, which we have been discussing. And so these are going to outline his formal powers, the powers that he can exercise as the executive of our state. And so his formal powers are going to include appointment powers, which are um, much less strong than some executives in other states, and certainly much less powerful than the president at the federal level. He does have some budgetary powers. He has some legislative powers. He has some control over the party, and he does have some judicial powers. And so I think the key word that you probably heard me say over and over and over again is some, because the governor's power is extremely limited, and it's not going to be very similar to some of the other executives that we are typically familiar with. And so let's start with appointment powers. There are 167 active agencies in Texas. Um, any kind of agency that's in the federal bureaucracy can fit into this category. And the governor is going to appoint some of these individuals. And one of the only executive branch official that he appoints is going to be the Secretary of State. And we talked about the Secretary of State a little bit in the last lecture. Most of the people in the executive branch are going to be elected in separate elections than the governor, and so he doesn't really have the power to determine who is going to be in the executive branch and who's going to be in his cabinet, essentially. And so the only individual that he really has the power to appoint at that executive level is the Secretary of State. And recently, the governor just appointed a new Secretary of State. And this appointment does require the Texas Senate to approve or deny the nomination, and so you will see a very similar sort of Senate Judiciary Committee hearing as you would at the federal level. And so while he does get to appoint the Secretary of State, it does have some legislative oversight. He appoints the executive directors of the Commerce Department, the Health and Human Services Department, Housing and Community Affairs Department, and the Insurance, Director of Insurance. He also appoints the director of the Office of Federal and State Relations and the Texas National Guard, as well as the Texas Education Agency. He also appoints the Chief Counsel of the Public Utilities Commission. And so he has the ability to appoint the heads of these different agencies, and so he can affect sort of the way that the bureaucracy will carry out the laws and carry out the execution of statutes and things like that. So he does have some power in that regard. Oh, he also appoints the State Office of Administrative Hearings. So the governor has budgetary powers as well, and budgetary powers are defined as the ability of the government to formulate a budget, present it to the legislature, and execute the budget. Okay? But there are some significant constraints on the governor's budgetary powers, and the constraints that are in place on his budgetary powers is that he shares budget formulation with the legislature. So he doesn't get to set the budget single-handedly. He has to do it in conjunction with the legislature. And the legislature is going to have a significant control over what the budget looks like. And when they pass a budget, they do it for the biennium because they only meet once every 2 years. And so it's a budget for 2 years at a time. And so another constraint that the governor has in regards to his budgetary powers is that a lot of funds are earmarked for specific expenditures that he really doesn't have a whole lot of control over. And so he's going to, his budget is going to be formulated by some things that are already in place that have to be funded. And he must share execution authority with state agencies. And so as the budget is executed, which is defined, up here in budgetary powers, as they execute this budget and decide how it's going to play out, he is not the only person that has the authority to execute it. The state agencies are going to play into this as well, and they're going to have a say in how their budget is going to be executed at the state level. And then there's the limits on the governor's use of a line item veto for the budget. And so the governor has the ability to utilize a line item veto, which means that he can actually veto a portion of the budget without vetoing the entire appropriations bill. So there can be some things that he will have the ability to veto, but this can get people in trouble. And when Pa Ferguson utilized the line item veto to veto the appropriations for the university system in Texas, it ended up that he was convicted and removed from office under impeachment charges. So the governor actually has relatively weak budgetary powers because we do have a legislative budget board which is chaired by the lieutenant governor and the Speaker of the House. And so again, we don't have a governor who has just a terrible amount of control over the budget because it is, as we've said previously, in conjunction with the legislature. And those two very powerful individuals in the legislature, the lieutenant governor and the speaker, are going to have a huge say in how that budget is going to be formulated. And so his legislative powers, these are going to fall under how he can affect legislation. And his most significant legislative power is the veto, especially that line item veto. And as I mentioned in the last slide, the line item veto is defined as the ability of a governor to veto part of an appropriations bill without vetoing the whole bill. And the President of the United States does not have this ability. It's all or nothing. And so the Texas governor does have this very significant legislative power. If he doesn't like a certain piece of the appropriations bill, then he can go through it line by line and veto whatever it is that he decides is not a very good idea. And the regular veto is very strong in Texas, and it's very strong because at the end of the 140 days of the legislature has to adjourn. They cannot call themselves, they can't extend their time. They can't call themselves back into legislative session. The only person that can do that is the governor. And so when bills are sent to his desk at the end of this legislative session, he has a certain amount of time to veto those. And if he does veto those, then the legislature usually is out of session and they can't override. So few have actually been overridden in state history, and none have been overridden since 1979. So we're going to see that to be a very strong power of the governor. He also has that pocket veto, meaning if the legislature is in session, he has 10 days to sign the bill or it becomes law. And so he's got some extreme powers in this regard. The legislature has adjourned. He has 20 days to sign the bill or it becomes law. And so when the legislature is out of session, he really has a lot of leeway in what he can veto and what he can let become law. Other legislative powers, he has the ability to object to legislation before a bill passes, and that can really influence what kind of legislation will pass the Texas the Texas legislature. Judicial power, defined as the ability of a governor to issue pardons, executive clemency, and parole of citizens convicted of a crime. And this power was historically misused. And there again, we see Jim Pa Ferguson jump to the forefront of this misuse of power, as we have seen periodically throughout the course of this unit. But the governor has certain powers to grant clemency and pardons and things like that. But because it has been misused over time, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles was created. And this is a 7-member board appointed by the governor. So the governor does exercise some control over the board. But the governor cannot take action on a parole or a clemency or a pardon without their recommendation. And so if this board does not make a recommendation to the governor, then the governor cannot really act. He cannot really offer executive clemency or parole or pardon to a certain individual who might have been convicted of a crime. Now, the only exception is that the governor has the ability to grant one 30-day stay of execution for a prisoner. So if there is a prisoner on death row who is set to be executed, the governor has the ability to grant one stay of execution in the amount of 30 days without the recommendation of the Board of Pardons and Paroles. And so these are some of the formal powers of the governor. The governor really doesn't have a terrible amount of formal powers. He is extremely limited in every aspect of his job. And many things in the state are going to be carried out by the lieutenant governor, who has a lot of power in the executive and especially the legislative branch, as he sits on a lot of those different boards and controls legislation through the Senate. So we're going to stop there, and I will see you in the next lecture.